Chapter 14 of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. Chapter 14, Part 1. Tsu-shima, 1905. When the War of 1894-95 between China and Japan was brought to a close by the Treaty of Shimonoseki, 17 April 1895, the Japanese were in possession of Korea and southern Manchuria, Port Arthur and the Liaotung Peninsula, Weihai and the Pescadores Islands, and a joint naval and military expedition was ready to seize Formosa. By the second article, China ceded to Japan the fortress and dockyard of Port Arthur and the Liaotung Peninsula. As soon as the terms of the treaty were published, Russia, which was the northern neighbor of China along the borders of Manchuria and Mongolia, and the neighbor of Japan by the possession of Vladivostok and Saghalien, protested against the cession of Port Arthur and its territory to the victors, arguing that the permanent occupation of Port Arthur by a foreign power would be a standing menace to the government at Peking, and would put an end to the independence of China. Germany and France joined in the Russian protest, and the three powers began to move their ships eastward. Their combined squadrons would have been more than a match for Admiral Ito's cruisers. England had a powerful squadron in the eastern seas, but observed a strict neutrality in the diplomatic strife. If England had joined her, Japan would undoubtedly have fought rather than yield up the fruit of her hard-won victories. But the Mikado's ministers realized that single-handed they could not face a triple alliance of aggressive European powers. The treaty was revised, the cession of Port Arthur and its territories being struck out of it. They were to be restored to China. But the statesmen of Japan, while they yielded the point, recognized in Russia their future rival for the Empire of the East, and resolved to begin at once preparing for a struggle in years to come which would give them back more than they were now forced to abandon. They set to work to create a powerful navy, and at the same time added steadily to the fighting strength of their army, which for a while found useful war training in the subjugation of the hill tribes of Formosa. The millions of the war indemnity and loans negotiated abroad were expended on a great scheme of armaments. A fleet of battleships, cruisers, and torpedo craft was built in foreign shipyards, and the personnel of the navy was increased to provide officers and crew. The Japanese government went on for years patiently preparing, regardless of conduct on the part of Russia that might have tempted a less self-possessed power to premature action. The Russian government had hardly forced Japan to abandon so large a part of her conquest when it took advantage of the weakness of China to obtain from the Peking government the right to make a railway through Manchuria to the treaty port of Niu Chwang, and to place garrisons along the new line for its protection, and further the right to garrison Port Arthur, use it as a naval station, and occupy the adjacent territory. When the first rumors of the Russo-Chinese treaty reached Europe, they were treated with incredulity. It was said that it was impossible that Russia could cynically claim a position which she had just declared was incompatible with the independence of China, and which she had argued the nations of Europe could not permit to Japan or any other power. But presently the treaty was published and acted upon, Russia making Port Arthur her chief naval station in the east, announcing a project for a great commercial port at Talanwan Bay, and further occupying the treaty port of Niu Chwang. There was a brief period of tension during which there was a talk of various powers resisting this barefaced aggression, but European statesmen thought that an easier course was open to them. Instead of resisting the aggressor, they embarked in a policy of aggression themselves, on the plea of securing compensations and guarantees. The weakness of China made her the ready victim for this policy. Foreign aggression from so many quarters called forth a patriotic movement in China, which in 1900 culminated in the Boxer Revolt. For a while Japan and the European powers, including Russia, became allies, to save their embassies and repress the rising about Peking. In the campaign the Japanese forces proved themselves the most efficient of all, and their chiefs returned home with an absolute confidence that they could successfully meet European soldiers in the field. Japan had made the most unsparing use of its rights in Korea, acquired by the Treaty of Shimonoseki, all but absolutely annexing the country. After the Boxer Revolt, Admiral Alexiev, who was governor of the Russian possessions in the Far East, embarked on a dangerous policy of provocation towards Japan. He had an ill-informed contempt for the hardy islanders. He underrated their power of resistance, and felt sure that the mere fact that the Russian fleet outnumbered theirs would secure the command of the sea for Russia, and have a decisive effect in the event of a conflict. He believed that the sooner it came, the better. The Russian fleet in the east was steadily reinforced, unit by unit. The Japanese people began to see in these proceedings, and in the work done at Port Arthur, a threat of early hostilities, and there was a general call on the government to anticipate the blow, when relations became strained between the two countries in 1903. The Tokyo government was anxious not to precipitate the war, for the organization of the army required some months for completion, but the feeling in the navy, army, and civil population forced its hand. After a brief delay of negotiations, during which both parties worked with feverish energy to secure additional armaments, diplomatic relations were broken off at the beginning of February 1904, and then, without waiting for any formal declaration of war, the Japanese torpedo flotilla swooped down on the Russian fleet lying in the roads outside the narrow entrance of Port Arthur, found them utterly unprepared to meet this sudden attack, and crippled several of the ships. A second blow was the destruction of the first-class armoured cruiser "Varyag," the Russian guardship at Chemulpo, by a Japanese squadron. Most of the best ships in the Russian navy were in the east at the outbreak of the war. Alexiev had, however, made the initial mistake of dividing the force at his disposal. Away north at Vladivostok was a squadron of 3 large armoured cruisers, the Gromoboi, Rosha, and Rurik, and the protected cruiser Bogatar. The Varyag was isolated at Chemulpo, the port of Seoul, doing duty that might have been left to a gunboat. At Port Arthur, under Admiral Stark, there was a strong fleet, including 7 battleships, the Petropavlovsk, Poltava, Peresviet, Pobida, Retsivan, Sebastopol, and Tsarevich, the cruisers Askoid, Boyarin, Bayan, Palada, Diana, and Novik, and a flotilla of torpedo craft and the mine-laying steamer Yenisei. In the torpedo attack on the evening of 8 February, the Retsivan, Tsarevich, and Palada were badly damaged. The Varyag was destroyed next day, and a few days later the Yenisei accidentally blew herself up while laying mines. This series of disasters seemed for a while to have almost destroyed the morale of the fleet. Stark set to work to repair his damaged ships, made no attempt to meet the Japanese at sea, or interfere with the transport of their armies to the mainland of Asia, and, subordinating his fleet to the defence of Port Arthur, even landed guns and men to strengthen the landward works. The Japanese blockaded the port, insulted it with long-range bombardments, and tried to block the narrow entrance by sinking old steamers across it. In March the arrival of the best officer in the Russian navy, Admiral Makarov, for a while inspired new energy into the Port Arthur fleet. The repairs of the injured ships were completed, and on 13 April the admiral steamed out to challenge Togo and the main Japanese fleet in battle. Notwithstanding precautions taken against the known danger of floating mines, the fleet entered a tract of water where several were afloat, and the flagship Petropavlovsk was destroyed with fearful suddenness by the explosion of one of them. There was great loss of life, but the most serious blow to Russia was the death of the admiral. After the fleet returned to the harbour there came another period of irresolute inactivity. It was not till August, when several ships had been injured at their anchors by the bombardment from the land batteries of the Japanese attack, and it was evident that the port would soon be a dangerous place for the ships, that Admiral Witjeft proceeded to sea, announcing that he was going to Vladivostok, the cruiser squadron from that port having been warned to come out and reinforce him on his way. The sea fight, known as the Battle of the 10th of August, took place a few miles to seaward of the port. Witjeft led the fleet in his flagship, the Tsarevich, followed by the battleships Retsivan, Sebastopol, Pobida, Poltava, and Peresviet, carrying the flag of the second in command, Rear Admiral Prince Ukhtomsky, and the cruiser division made up of the Askoid, carrying the flag of Rear Admiral Reitzenstein, Palada, Diana, and Novak, besides 8 destroyers. The cruiser Bayan had been so damaged that she was left in port. Witjeft had a marked superiority in battleships. Togo had had 6 new first-rate ships of the class under his command at the outset of the war, but on 15 May he had lost 2 of them, one-third of his battleship fleet, by a disaster like that of the Petropavlovsk. On that May morning, while cruising off Port Arthur, he ran into a field of drift mines, and in a few minutes the battleships Hatsus and Tsu-shima and cruiser Yoshino were destroyed. The Japanese managed till the end of the war to conceal the fact